Hello. You know, for me, the enduring athletics image of the 1980s is of a comparatively slight figure rounding the final bend in the 1500 metres, with daylight apparently showing between his feet and the ground, then moving into a higher gear, hitherto unknown to man, and easing past, well, anybody who happened to be in his way. He did this twice in Olympic finals, might well have done it 3 times had he not been cruelly spurned by the selectors, and now it looks as if he's about to do very much the same thing as a candidate in the next general election. And after that, anyone who doesn't know I'm talking about Sebastian Coe is watching the wrong programme. Seb, it's good to see you here.
Thank you.
When you look back to the 1980 Olympics, Moscow, what do you remember most vividly? The fact that you won the 1500 metres or the fact that you didn't win the 800, which everybody thought you were going to win?
Oh, I think it has to be that, obviously, after a few soul-searching days, I came back and won the 15. But the losing the first Olympic final, the 800 metres, is etched very deeply still.
Well, your father said he ran like an idiot, didn't he?
That was for the newspapers, and not exactly what he said to me.
He said something worse to you. And also I'm told a woman sent you a telegram saying, "Pull your bloody finger out, Coe, I've got money on you."
That's right, yes. Yeah. I mean, they're all nice little motivational things along the way, plus a little bit of shop floor language from the coach.
Yeah, and about the coach, your father, Peter, he's coached you right from day one, hasn't he? Is it true that when you were 13, he was already gearing you towards the Moscow Olympics?
Yes, he was, and it was I remember walking off a rain-soaked field late one evening after a long training session, and I can't have been more than about 14 at the time, and he said, very matter-of-factly, that be prepared for the fact that you're going to go to the 1980 Olympics, and it was 6-7 years away. And he said, it comes as a great shock to some people. I don't want it to come as a shock to you.
What, was he kind of Svengali?
No, not at all. I mean, he was very logical about it. And the point about it is that I got into athletics and running because I wanted to. He came in afterwards on the basis that as any parent who takes an interest in any of the kids in their family, realised that I was spending a lot of time doing that, and that his great contribution to me was not just the training, but the fact that he actually helped me through the training to lead what was probably a much better balanced life through my teens than I would normally have had I not had somebody who was close to me, knowing what I was doing, but making sure that there were other things that had to be done, just as simple, social life, being able to get out, not being pinned to athletics all the time.
Well, but was he, do you think, in any way living vicariously through you? Was he a frustrated top-class athlete himself? No,
he wasn't. I mean, he was a good class cycle racer, and anybody that anybody that knows him knows that one of the greatest motivations in his life is for people to improve themselves. My sister was a good dancer. I mean, he made sure that when he was told that she had some talent, he did his best to get her to the Royal Ballet School, where she went. He's always had a great supporting influence on the rest of the kids in my family.
I'm glad instantly that we've changed the tense, because earlier on we were talking about him as if he was no longer with us. But
no, he's still coaching.
Did you ever rebel, either of you, against this? Because kids tend to, don't they? The parent says, "Okay, you are going to do this." Did you ever say, "Oh, the hell with it, I don't want to be a top-class runner"?
No. I mean, the interesting thing is that the most important influence that he has had has actually been slowing me down. I would, certainly through my younger years, have trained instinctively a lot harder than I should have done, or would have done in terms of actual safety limits. He had the great good sense to know that anything in athletics does not develop quickly, it doesn't develop overnight. Even to the point where we used to live in Sheffield, most of my training was done on steep moorland hills along the roads through Derbyshire. He instinctively felt that it was perfectly okay to run up hills, but to bash out your knees down hills was stupid. So I would get into the car, and he'd take me to the bottom of the hill, and then we'd work hard up the hills, and that's probably why I'm still running at the age of 33.
Yeah, but running downhill, it always seems easier. What about your mother's part in all this? Was she a sort of placid figure in the background, somebody you revolved around, or was she active as well?
Well, I'm very pleased you mentioned that, because it's the point I would have wanted to have made, and that is that if you are coached by your father, then there is no way that that doesn't become a family involvement. And I can look at it on two levels. Her involvement with what I did was as important as what he has done in terms of the training, because the kind of disruption that that athletics inflicts on anybody's lifestyle, but particularly when it's actually internalised and you have somebody from the same family coaching you, and you both spend hours and hours a day actually on a coaching, on a running track or in a gymnasium. The important thing was that we didn't actually become estranged from the rest of the family, and she provided the balance, and in fact nicely so, because we would always as a family, even through the most ridiculous disruptions, try and sit down for at least one meal together a day, and that of course took some planning. But also she would make sure that it was never really taken out of perspective, and if we ever just got into a conversation at the dinner table about athletics, there'd be two sisters and a brother and my mother who would all just shout boring at us, and we'd move on to a subject that the whole family could join in.
Keeps your feet on the ground.
Certainly, that was a very important part.
You know, after 1980 Olympics, they were gold medalists, silver medalists, you had the MBE. You then started to get involved in the politics of sport, didn't you? Now, was that also carefully planned?
No, it wasn't. I was invited to address the International Olympic Committee Congress in 1981 in West Germany. And at the time, we were just beginning. It was the first time that any athletes actually had been asked to ever address the Congress. We'd been there as observers, or had observer status in 1973. But it always struck me as ludicrous that something like the Olympic movement, that depended obviously on its success and its shop window, on what happened on the track and in the gymnasium and in the pool, very rarely ever consulted with the people at the sharp end. So we were invited to address the Congress, and in fact I was eventually elected to make the final address on the last day. And it went from there. I made a speech actually condemning drug abuse in sport, which was then beginning to become sort of a media interest. And from that point on, I realised that we had athletes, sportsmen and women generally, had singular little input into the decisions that went on in international and domestic governing bodies. And it was at that point I realised that's what I would like to do, and try and redress the balance for the next few years.
And the seeds of a political career were no doubt sown then?
I think they were. I mean, I've always been interested in politics and current affairs and political affairs, but there's no doubt that in my 6 years at the Sports Council and in the final 3 years as Vice Chairman, hardened and sharpened up a political awareness.
You were also very much in the forefront in getting the Athletics Federation to change its rules about athletes being able to keep money. And then you and Colin Moynihan brought out the Moynihan Coe report about drugs, and I know you were against drugs, but isn't there a kind of irony in the fact that you helped athletes to get money, and then the drugs problem came up, and surely the drugs, to some extent, the taking of drugs is motivated by the fact that there is now money to be made in athletics? I
think the two issues are separate. I wouldn't want anybody to run away with the idea that the problems we have in sport in terms of drug abuse are a relatively recent phenomenon. They're not. I mean, if you go back to even to the ancient Olympics and Greek sport, historians will tell us that Greek athletes were taking all sorts of substances, thinking in the hope that they would improve their performance.
No testing then, of course.
No testing, of course. Well, certainly not random testing. Anyway. The problem that we now are surrounded by is one that is a global one. I mean, historically, I could tell you that the response that the problems in the Eastern Bloc that we have with drug abuse were a direct response to what was going on unabated on the American university campuses in the 1950s. I think the point here is that we're far too far down the road now to start pointing fingers either east or west. We do actually have a global, universal problem. I don't think that money, I mean, there's no doubt, to a certain extent, of course, money is a motivating factor for a lot of people in sport.
Yeah.
And that, you know, when you have races or putts or whatever it is, with thousands of dollars resting on them, there is a very keen awareness that you want to be successful. I actually think that there will always be people at the margin of any activity that will cheat, and we're no different in sport. And if people, there will always be a few people that think that the shortcut through, not just to money, but to fame and to all the bits and pieces that go with the glory of winning races, the shortcut through will be to take drugs. Yeah,
and I believe, I think you do too, that people like Ben Johnson should be banned for life as a
I don't think there's any doubt about that.
But, you know, on the subject of money, to what extent has money influenced your decision to keep running for as long as you have? Because, you know, after 1984, you had a point to prove there, didn't you? Because everybody written you off and you went to the Olympics and you did the 1500 again, making rather rude gestures to the media. Am I right?
I don't know if they were that rude. I mean, I often think back, they probably were rude actually when I think back. I look at that as being, I mean, what happened in '84 in the Olympics was, yes, I had been written off. A lot of journalists had decided that it was a case of yesterday's man and all that sort of stuff. Well, actually, any good competitor would allow that to eat away at them to the point where, you know, it's the old Kennedy adage, you know, get mad and get even. Well, get both. And I think that's the what I actually lived with for a year. Bubbled through in the last few strides of the 1500 metres. It was a mixture of relief and pure aggression that came bubbling through.
Ferociously triumphant look, I seem to remember.
Yes, I mean, most athletes go through that. Mine, unfortunately, that day was a wee bit more visible than most.
But again, do you think you would still be running now if the financial rewards were not as great as they are today?
Yes, I would, because although I'm probably the last generation of those athletes, athletes like myself, Steve Ovett, Brendan, Alan Pascoe, those guys that have been through and finishing now or finished within the last few years, came into the sport simply because it was a sport we wanted to do. Of course, we all know that there were some under-the-counter payments, and it was a system that had to be regularised, and that's why I was so keen to help with that in the early 80s. But by and large, nobody left school or put off a career or didn't go to university on the basis that here we are, there's athletics, it's $1 million career, let's get into that. I mean, most athletes realise that athletics at the level that we were doing it, I mean, I've often said at that level you are only one injury away from oblivion. Well, 10 years ago you didn't even have the financial support to fall back on. And I'm quite open, I mean, I would have competed had we still been back 10 years ago in the system of the second-class rail fare and the 75p meal voucher. And I think, in fairness, most athletes, even today, although there's financial reward, it's far too tough a sport not to have some innate feel for, rather than just simply a monetary return.
Yeah, but obviously money does play an important part in athletics now, because it's noticeable that you never confront on the racetrack people like Cram, Ovett, Awita, Belay, except in a big championship. And I suspect, in my cynical way, that that's because if you all ran against each other, whoever came second, third, fourth and fifth wouldn't be offered so much money to run in the next meet.
Well, that isn't actually strictly true. I've run against Steve Cram outside of championships on many occasions. I raced Abdi Beeley in a Grand Prix race back in 1988. Awita has on occasions been a little bit more difficult for us all to track down. The Steve situation is an interesting one, because we were quite open about it, that we felt that when we met, particularly in the massive interest that was around us in the late 70s.
This is Ovett.
Steve Ovett, yeah, the other Steve. That we felt we should meet in major championships, and that we knew we were going to have to fight out the spoils. in Moscow, and it would be ridiculous to run on a a wet night in Gateshead or anywhere else in the world when the world was really waiting to watch it in an Olympic stadium. And I actually feel happier that we did it that way and not in an orgy of commercialism, which it would certainly have descended to at that stage in our careers. Yeah, there's no doubt that athletes have been avoiding each other recently, and we had examples of that this year. I went to Zurich, where what was billed as a Beeley Cider to Seb Coe race in the 1500. I was there in the end, the only one that actually ran the 1500. Abdi went down to the 8 and Syed decided he wanted the 5 at the last minute. So there's no doubt that there is a little bit of politicking around the status and the appearance in these races. But I rather fancy that the other point that really has to be made is that a lot of the reason for that is that athletes genuinely start their season from different points of view with different targets in mind, and it often means that a head-to-head might suit television, it might suit the public, but 8 or 9 weeks before a major championship, I particularly would not want to be in the kind of shape where I would have to tackle people and run well that early, when in fact I have to tackle the same people, when very much more is at stake in a major championship. We all lust after medals. Still? The hunger is still there for medals? Oh, yes. I mean, more so in many respects than younger, because the one thing that... I mean, the sad realisation for most people in sport is that mentally they're at their toughest when physically it's beginning to disappear. It's trying to get the graph, those two lines, to actually join when mentally and physically you're actually at your peak. I'm certainly mentally tougher now than I was 10 years ago. But you got that preparation wrong in '88, didn't you? I think I got it right. You got it right? Yeah. Well, then why were you not selected? Was it because in your job with the Sports Council you have made a lot of enemies and people there said, we'll get back at Coe, he hasn't done what he's supposed to do, we have every justification for not taking him to Seoul? The conspiracy theory there has been fairly well, and in fairness, I think pretty accurately plotted by some of our senior writers and experts in athletics. Well, what conclusion have they come to? Well, I think there were a number of things. I mean, firstly, there was no doubt that I was very vociferous about what I thought was a pretty ludicrous selection system. You can't ask athletes to be fit 8, 9, really fit 8, 9, 10 weeks before a major championship. We have as a nation only an ability to win a handful of medals at any championship. We have a massively strong British team, but when it really comes down to the finals of major championships, the coaches, even the athletes themselves, will tell you that there are probably only 4 or 5 real solid medal chances in any team. My attitude was quite simple. I just did not see that a one-off afternoon in Birmingham, which is where our trials tend to be, proved anything other than the fact that on that afternoon, if you threw a dice and you ended up with a 6, you went with the team, and if you threw a 1, you were out. Now, last year, I think in fairness, I was probably the only major casualty in that process. This year, we've now got, certainly in terms of an English team in the Commonwealth Games, we have many more problems. I mean, we have a ludicrous situation where in one event you're having to choose between Linford Christie, who is the reigning European champion and the fastest sprinter we've ever produced in this country, and John Regis, who was a bronze medalist in the World Championships in 1987 and one of the best talents we've ever had over 200 metres. That just has to be ludicrous in a country as small as ours, where I think the job of selection is exactly that. It is to select across the board. Yes, of course you pick people's race form. Yes, you have to be aware that they're in reasonable shape that year, but you have to look back at the way people respond to championship situations. Were you very bitter about not going to Seoul? I was disappointed because, as a response to your first question, I actually thought my preparation was going extremely nicely, bearing in mind that the Olympic Games were not going to be until October, which was very, very late. It was the people I said at the beginning of the year that would win medals in those championships were the people that were pacing themselves. And I felt that, well, in fairness, I did absolutely nothing different this year than I did last year. But again, if we go back to the old shake of that dice, on that afternoon in Birmingham, I was ill and I threw a 1. This year in Birmingham, in exactly the same trial situation, I stumbled virtually face down on the track for 15 paces, but kept my feet. The difference between this year and last year is I'm going to a major championship.
You know, this past decade, we've had you, we've had Ovett, we've had Cram and Peter Elliott. Do you think this will ever be repeated? That, in other words, that there will be 4 white British runners who will dominate the middle distances, because the Africans are doing that now, aren't they? They're dominating everything on the track.
Yeah.
Do you think that we will ever again have a time when there's a Coe and a Cram who are number 1, number 2, vying for those positions?
Yes, we have to be optimistic about it.
But will they be black rather than
well?
White?
I mean, we've got thank goodness, athletics in the UK is a multiracial affair. So I mean, we're as likely to have black talent coming through as we are white talent. What I think we will have to be prepared for in the UK is that athletics is a 13, 14, 15 discipline event. So instead of the fans going to Crystal Palace and Gateshead and Birmingham, or sitting and watching on television, watching a Coe or a Cram or an Ovett in middle distance, we're going to have to face the fact that athletics is about other events, and while we don't perhaps have great talent or great strength in depth for a few years at middle distance, we've got guys like Steve Backley, Colin Jackson, Linford, John Regis, Fatima, Tessa, people like that, doing it in other events. Yeah. And it's going to take, I rather fancy it's going to take a slight re-educating of a British athletics public to realise that athletics is not just about middle or long distance running.
How do you feel though, Seb, that knowing that in the early 80s you were indisputably the number 1 and you're not indisputably the number 1 anymore, is that hard to take?
No, it isn't, because the point about it is that I've realised that, you see, in fairness, I've been through 3 generations of athletes. I came onto the scene at the end of the 70s, and obviously in 1980 with guys like Steve Ovett and the strength of some of the East German runners, and they've now effectively departed the scene in terms of real world-class performances. I mean, there are 1 or 2 left, and Steve is obviously still capable of running pretty well. I then went on through to 1984 and fought off what I called at that stage the teenage muggers, who were on the circuit, and the Joachim Cruises and guys like that, but still was there or thereabouts. I'd got through that generation, and then to come into the next generation of sort of Tommy McKeans and what I call the 1970 birth certificates, which is, you know, is a sobering thought. And even in Barcelona a couple of weeks ago, I was giving on balance about 8 or 9 years away to most of the people there, but you know, managed to still finish in the medals. I'm not so naive to believe that will go on forever. I've seen the writing on the wall, but I think I'm still capable of running pretty well, but I wouldn't want to be around the circuit as long as somebody like John Walker, for instance.
No, and obviously it's a Commonwealth Games after that, particularly if you come back with a medal, nice time to segue into politics. But why on earth do you want to be an MP? It seems to me to be an absolutely awful job.
Well, it probably is. I mean, the point is that I've always wanted to go into politics, and that if you go through, obviously, into the parliamentary system, that is the process. In fairness, one of my motivations to go into politics is the role of the MP, which I think is an important role. I would like to feel that I would be a good constituency MP. Local issues interest me as well as national interests, and we know to our cost, certainly politically, that local issues can certainly turn elections. Yeah. They are important in themselves. I accept the fact that the life of an MP is a pretty unsociable one.
But I assume that if you're going to go into politics, you're going to go in the House, you want to be Prime Minister because you clearly wanted to be #1 at everything else you've done. Would you like to be Prime Minister?
That is such.
Don't be modest.
No,
tell me.
I mean, no. There is an honest answer to that, and of course, anybody that goes into politics and looks at it in terms of a career, which is what I would do, would want to be successful in what they did. You temper that by the fact that I am not allowing myself to think of that career as anything at the moment other than as a very long, hard slog, and a learning curve that will be steeper and far harder than any that I've had so far.
So Mrs. Thatcher can rest easy for a little while, can't she?
No, I mean, the point about it is that I think anybody that goes in with any ambition at all wants to succeed in what they're doing, but at the moment I'm so much in the infancy of what I'm trying to do that it really is, it's a day-to-day learning process.
You know, looking back over your career, everything seems to have been very carefully planned, very carefully controlled. Do you ever do anything spontaneously? I mean, would you be inclined to go out and get drunk one night, not planning it, or would you make a wild pass at some girl at a party? I mean, do you do spontaneous things, or do you plan everything?
What, with the British tabloid press around? They wiped out spontaneity 20 years ago, I think. No, I mean, I actually lead what I think, in terms of what I know and see of most athletes, as a pretty balanced existence. I mean, I've always had other things outside of athletics. I like to feel I have as good a social life within the confines that, you know, that everybody has in terms of time commitments and pressures.
Does marriage enter into your plans in any way at all? Is that...
Not at the moment, but eventually, yes. I mean, I think the honest answer to that is that I've still, you know, I mean, there have been hellish time constraints, and obviously an athletics career is not the easiest thing to combine with a family life. But obviously, in the future, that will be, you know, that will be something I would like to do. But at the moment, I haven't any hard and fast plans. I'm still looking.
Oh, good. Well, I'm sure there are a lot of girls out there who'd be delighted to hear that, Seb. You know, looking at what it takes to be a top-class athlete, top-class sportsman of any kind, I mean, obviously talent and dedication and hard work, but also it seems to me that you need qualities, and you probably need these in Parliament too, qualities like arrogance and ruthlessness. Do you recognise those qualities in yourself? Do you possess them?
I think anybody that has competed at the top level in sport will recognise a certain amount of that trait in themselves. I mean, yes, of course, there has to be an element of arrogance to believe that you can step out into an Olympic final in front of 100,000 people in Moscow or Los Angeles and genuinely feel that you're going to the starting line with a chance of walking off with a gold medal. I mean, that's either huge naivety or a massive amount of arrogance or a mixture of the two. Inevitably, there has to be a level of ruthlessness, because at the end of the day, in any racing situation, you can only have one winner. I think that the most important factor in all that is just the willingness to submit yourself to hours and hours and hours of unremitting hard work in all weathers, and in sometimes the most uncomfortable of circumstances. I think that's far more important than ruthlessness and arrogance.
And you realise, of course, that you've just described what you're going to have to do as a